Hello and welcome to Decks Done Right TCG. This is the interesting deck tech I'm going to show you of Modern / Legacy Burn. Right now, currently I have the Modern setup shown here, and then I'm going to show you how it converts over to Legacy, and it's beautiful. So first and foremost, we're going to run through this deck tech, starting off with the creatures. We got the best one-drop red creature of all time in Goblin Guide, 2/2 with haste. Whenever he attacks, defending player reveals the top card of their library. If it's a land card, they put it into their hand. This is supposed to be a drawback because they essentially get to draw a card if it is a land. However, the revealing of information actually can be important. If you see that, they revealed a counter spell or a removal spell or something like that, you can then know to play around those cards. But it's an early source of damage that is just beautiful for 1 mana. Next, we got Eidolon of the Great Revel, and this is probably the glue that pushed this deck in Modern to the forefront, because so many spells, both in Legacy and in Modern, cost 3 or less. And so what it says is, whenever a player casts a spell with converted mana cost of 3 or less, Eidolon of the Great Revel deals 2 damage to that player. So it works both ways. Your spells, all your spells are under 3 mana, so you do take damage. But because you're applying so much more damage to your opponent, you're getting the benefit because you're still applying pressure. And if they want to kill it with something other than a mass board wipe that costs 4 or more, they're going to take damage from it. So even though it doesn't have haste to get in there with damage, this card gets damage because of the inherent ability of, if it gets targeted or if they play anything, they have to take 2 damage. Next up is the backup Goblin Guide, I guess. A lot of players refer to her as the next of kin, I guess. Anyways, she's a 1 mana haste with prowess, which means whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And so, because we play so many spells, and believe it or not, a decent amount of them are these are sorcery speed. So you do have to play them on your own turn anyways. So you might as well get a benefit out of it. So she does basically an imitation of Goblin Guide without revealing the top of the opponent's deck. So on average, she's going to get 2 damage as well. But if you play her on the first turn, obviously you're only going to get the 1 damage. Next up is Grim Lavamancer, and this particular card has been in and out of the deck for me a lot. Put it in, then taking it out. It's kind of like a meta card, and right now, especially in Modern, Legacy, it tends to stay in more often, but in Modern, it fluctuates. But right now, because of Bloodbraid Elf and cards like that that only have 2 power, this card is a house. Basically, you can shoot down the Bloodbraid Elf, and like a Tireless Tracker, you can shoot that down. The turn it comes in, stuff like that. So this card is actually really strong. And because we play the fetches and so many instants and sorceries, you have a lot of graveyard to fill up. So he typically has a lot of fuel to use his ability. His ability is red and tap, exile 2 cards from your graveyard, and then Grim Lavamancer deals 2 damage to target creature or player. Now, what I will say about some of these cards here is there's going to be an errata pretty soon, supposedly before the set of Dominaria releases, that has an adjustment to the redirection rule for Planeswalkers. And it's going to affect red the most because red has more cards than any other color that deals direct damage. So this should still be viable once the errata happens, but we'll see how many cards are affected. Next up is Searing Blaze. So much like Grim Lavamancer benefits out of playing fetch lands, Searing Blaze also gains from playing fetch lands. And so paying 2 mana to deal 3 damage to a creature or player, and a player is really big. What it says is for 2 mana, Searing Blaze deals 1 damage to target creature and player. Or I'm sorry, Searing Blaze deals 1 damage to target player and 1 damage to target creature that player controls. If you have landfall, it does the same ability but for 3. But because you trigger landfall so often, it's going to be 3 almost every single time. There are going to be some of those times when you don't have the fetch land, but I'm going to go over the fetch land part in just a minute when we get down to the lands. But this is a really strong card, and as you know, some of you guys might know, this, because it has 2 targets, whenever someone tries to like sack their creature in response thinking that it's going to fizzle, the other target of them is still a valid target, so therefore the spell will not fizzle, and therefore they will still take the damage, even though they sack their creature. Next we got Boros Charm, and this is also a really strong card in Modern specifically because yeah, it's typically ran as a red and a white, deal 4 damage to target player. But let's say you're in the case of you got a Goblin Guide or an Eidolon down, and your opponent doesn't have a board. If they go to kill your creature and they don't really have a board behind them, you can save them with giving your permanents indestructible until for this turn mode, and that actually can continue to allow your creatures to deal damage, because a lot of the problem with burn as a whole is your creatures are typically small, all of them in this case, 2/2s or less, and this one's a 1/2, but sometimes it's a 2/3. What happens is your creatures get outclassed by like Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf becomes like a 4/5 or whatever, and then your 2/2 looks pretty awful. So you have, if they have a board, then sure, you just let your Goblin guy die. But if they don't and they're kind of tapped out trying to deal with an Eidolon or what have you, if you save it, then you get to keep doing more damage. So it's pretty, that mode can be used. And the other one of Double Strike, like that's a rarity, but I mean, typically you use it in conjunction with her because she can get big enough to make it relevant, because you would have to cast one spell and then another spell. No, I'm sorry. You would have to cast two different spells before Boros Charm for it to make it worth it. Because even at a spell plus this, that would be 6 damage, but it can do 4 itself. So it would still be 7 with them together doing the first mode. So you would have to wait and do 2 additional spells plus this for it to be worth it to do the Double Strike. So that doesn't happen very often. Next up is Lightning Helix. This is a really strong card right now because of the fact that a lot of the decks are aggressive in Modern. You have Affinity, Boggles, Infect. While Infect doesn't really care what life you have, it's still another ability to target creatures, so that's kind of important. But you also have various red-green aggressive strategies are out there, zoo, different stuff. So being able to shoot down a creature and gain 3 life is pretty big. Next up is, you can also shoot that at your opponent too. Lightning Helix deals 3 damage to target creature or player, and you gain 3 life. Next up is Rift Bolt, which is basically this guy, but for delayed a turn. So Rift Bolt says deal 3 damage to target creature or player. It has suspend of 1, so you pay 1 red mana, and so rather than playing the card, you suspend it, and it goes into suspend with 1 counter on it. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a suspend counter, and then you are able to cast the card for free. So it is Lightning Bolt because it can target a player or a creature, but it's delayed a turn, and it's at sorcery speed. So it's slow, but there are times whenever you just need more spells that deal 3 damage to target creature or player. There are also those corner cases wherever a player has you on a Chalice of 1, Chalice of the Void, and so paying 3 mana for it is actually pretty good. So that way you can get around Chalice and stuff like that. Next up is another sorcery speed card, but it's Lava Spike. It deals 3 damage to target player. So this one doesn't hit creatures, which is kind of a negative thing, but you still want to get the goal of the deck is to obviously get your opponent down to 0 as fast as possible. But a lot of times it's good to have abilities to target creatures to prevent yourself from dying or get through more damage with your creatures. So that is important, but dealing 3 damage to a player is pretty important as well. Lastly, for the spells, we've got Skullcrack, and players can't gain life this turn, and then damage can't be prevented this turn, and then Skullcrack deals 3 damage to target player. So these have this card specifically has some pretty important parts on it. Specifically, the first part is that the players can't gain life. Life gain is the bane of Burn's existence. We cannot stand that, but it happens. That's part of the game. Next up is damage can't be prevented this turn, and I'll touch on that in just a minute whenever we get to the sideboard cards. But then lastly is Skullcrack deals 3 damage to target player. Now, I wanted to make mention of these 2 cards specifically because these 2 cards get around, and this one, sorry, get around the card's Spellskite. A lot of the spells here can get redirected to Spellskite, but these 3 spells here can't be redirected to Spellskite, so those are actually important because Spellskite can be a pain for burn as well because it can redirect all of our burn spells that we want to point at the opponent's face to it. So it's pretty important. All right, for next up is the lands, and while it's not nothing crazy here, the Inspiring Vantages are actually a pretty big deal. It is essentially for burn specifically, it is like a plateau in Legacy because it comes into the battlefield untapped if you can control 2 or fewer lands, and generally burn will run on 2 to 3 lands, so that's perfect. Like you don't want to draw more than 3 lands. That's a bad idea. If you get, there are times when it's going to happen, but most of the time, if you have a hand with 4 lands as your opener, you're going to shuffle that back because you don't want 4 lands in your hand. Next up is the fetches. So you can go get your Sacred Foundry or your Mountain. Again, those are big for these guys here to help you out with that. And then that's pretty much it for the core of the deck. The sideboard is down here. So next up is the sideboard, and we've got 2 copies of Volcanic Fallout. This is pretty good on the small creature deal. Decks like Delver and Mardu Pyromancer and stuff like that. Dealing 2 damage to each creature and each player, and it can't be countered. Those are pretty big deals. So that way, you know, you could just push through that extra little bit of damage and try to board wipe if need be. It's also good against a lot of elves too. Just a lot of black-white tokens, a lot of various small go-wide strategies that's pretty good against. Next up is Grafdigger's Cage, and this particular card says for 1 mana, creature cards can't enter the battlefield from graveyard or library. Players can't cast cards in graveyard or libraries. So this particular card says that basically dredge players can't have fun, and decks like Collected Company, they also can't have fun because they are coming from the deck. So those cards, well, you know, same thing with other Snapcaster Mage. He can't cast any of the cards out of the graveyard. So there's a lot of cards that this is applicable to, and so it's a graveyard hate that is pretty strong. And it also hits other decks too, like elves. They can't go Collected Company into other elves, or they can't use the Convoke spell. It's escaping me right now, the name of it. Court of Calling. They can't use Court of Calling to go get their Craterhoof Behemoth because they can't pull it from the library. Next up is probably one of the best sideboard cards. It's so beautiful. So Deflecting Palm for red and a white says the next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. If it is prevented this way, Deflecting Palm deals that much damage to that source's controller. So this gets around things like Leyline of Sanctity because it doesn't target. Neither parts of this card target. So it doesn't target the creature and it doesn't target the player. So cards like Emrakul, for instance, if somebody surprises you with Emrakul, you float the mana, you sack all your stuff, whatever, and then you target, or you don't target, but you play Deflecting Palm on Emrakul after they've attacked with it, and you just dome them for 15. It's great. Like, you win that game. It's a busted card. It also, if an inflict player tries to go all in and kill you on 1 turn, this also gets them because you can just redirect the infect back at the other opponent, or at least it could buy you a turn. If they try to play around it, you can still, get a decent amount of their pump spells out of their hand, so that way you can clear them off with the other removal spells you have. Next up is Wear Tear. This is a interesting card in that it's basically 2 cards on 1 card. For 2 mana, a red and a white, you can destroy target artifact, or you can pay 1 white, destroy target enchantment, or you can pay 1 a red and a white and do both cards, or both parts of this card rather. This is specifically a reason why to run white is to destroy enchantments. Leyline of Sanctity is ran a lot in Modern, so because of that, it's good to have enchantment destruction. Now, a lot of players will play a 1/of Stomping Ground and play Destructive Revelry instead, which is a 1 red and 1 green destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it deals 2 damage to that player. Well, while this doesn't do damage, there are corner cases where it's a better card. Also, in that you're also having to pay more life to play that card, typically, on average. So you're better off saving some life and playing this instead. Next up is Kor Firewalker, and this is the worst nightmare for burn by far. It's for 2 white, protection from red. Whenever a player casts a red spell, you may gain 1 life. And you play this in your burn deck, so whenever you play against a burn deck or goblins or whatever, you just basically win, unless they have a card like this card here, Path to Exile. If they don't have that card, you just win. You win that race because you're already dealing pressure with all of your other cards, and so this just destroys another burn deck or a goblin deck, whatever. Next up is, or lastly, for the modern version of this deck, is Path to Exile. This is good to get rid of opposing Kor Firewalkers or really big creatures that can deal a lot of damage to you, such as Tarmogoyfs or Gurmag Anglers or whatever. Really big creatures that you have a tough time dealing with. This is helpful to get rid of those. And it just says, exile target creature. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card. Put that card onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle his or her library. So they do get a land to ramp, but you basically you don't want to pass like a ramp, like a Birds of Paradise or a Noble Hierarch or anything. That's what you got the bolts for. But big stuff, that's what that's for. So this is the modern version, right? And now we're gonna jump into the legacy version. So it's almost a 1-for-1 swap. And so I'm gonna show you here what this looks like. So the 4 mountains are going to replace the 4 Inspiring Vantages because we don't want to get wastelanded out of the game. And so but we still, I'm going to show you why we're running 2 white sources here in just a moment. But one of the benefits of Burn and Legacy is that you're not risk of getting wastelanded, and you get to play one of the best cards in Legacy. And we'll go over that in just a moment. So next up is a 1-for-1 swap of Chain Lightning over Lightning Helix. So the white splashes only for the sideboard, which we'll get to in just a moment. So we don't want to have any white cards in our main board. Chain Lightning is another sorcery speed lightning bolt. It's beautiful. Granted, your opponent may be able to pay 2 red and redirect it back at you or a creature, but on average, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So just be prepared that if opponent does have 2 red mana available, that they could do it. Or if they have 2 Deathrite Shamans, they could possibly redirect it. So next up is Price of Progress. This is the reason why we don't want to run very much white. This card is the bee's knees. It's an instant speed, 2 mana, one colorless, 1 red. Price of Progress deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls. And this card is huge right now because so many decks play non-basic lands. The current top decks arguably are Grixis Control, I'm sorry, Grixis control, 4-color control, check pile is the other name for it. There's also lands. There's various decks that like play just a ton of non-basics. So this actually keeps them in check. Next up is another card, and this is 4 of as well, is Fireblast. And this is your finisher. It's beautiful for a couple reasons. First, I'll tell you the ability. It's for 4 mana and 2 red, 4 colors, 2 red. You may sacrifice 2 mountains instead of paying Fireblast's casting cost, and then Fireblast deals 4 damage to target creature or player. So once you've burned them out and you've spent all your mana, you can then sack 2 mountains to do the last 4 damage to kill your opponent. It's bad to see in multiples, but you definitely want to see it. Another notable thing is because it's 6 mana, it gets around Eidolon, so you're not going to take damage from Eidolon. But yeah, that is generally your closer, quote unquote. All right. Next up is a card that is going to be hotly contested, but I'm going to explain why. So Vexing Devil is going to take over 2 spots of Swiftspear and 2 spots of Searing Blaze. Now the reason why it's good in Legacy and not in Modern is because in Legacy there's not as much spot removal. In Modern it's all over the place. In Legacy there's not a ton of it, so they are more than likely going to take the 4 damage. So it becomes essentially a better lava spike. It becomes a 1 mana deal 4 damage. And the reason why I took out 2 of the Swiftspear and 2 of the Searing Blazes is because Searing Blaze is not as great in Legacy because there are certain decks that don't even play creatures at all. So it doesn't have targets and can be a dead card. So it's okay to swap these out. And then Monastery Swiftspear is a good card, but 1 mana deal 4 damage is still a better card. And more times than not, if you, outside of Tarmogoyfs and whatnot, like most of the creatures don't pair up against a 4/3, so they have to take the 4 damage. All right. Then next up is we're going to do some replacements in the sideboard. So we place 2 Sulfuric Vortex. I used to play this in the main, but now I play it in the sideboard because 3 mana is hard to come by. So this is the anti-life gain card. Like I said, there's not a ton of life gain that is ran in Legacy, but some decks do run it. So you gotta be careful of it. But this says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, Sulfuric Vortex deals 2 damage to that player. If a player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. So it prevents all the life damage, or it prevents all the life gain, and each upkeep they take 2 damage. So you're still continuing to apply pressure. Next up is 3 copies. This is going to look weird, or I'll do this first. 2 copies of Smash the Smithereens. So because enchantments aren't really that big of a thing in Legacy that are worth Burn's time to deal with, Smash the Smithereens deals with artifacts, which do happen very often in Legacy. There's actually a bunch of mana rocks, Chrome Mox and Lotus. Well, Lotus Petal is not a good one to target, but there's a lot of different mana rocks, Mox Diamond, stuff like that you can target with Smash to slow your opponent down a little bit, and they also take 3 damage. Destroy target artifact, Smash Smithereens deals 3 damage to that artifact's controller. And so lastly, to fill that 3rd spot and 2 here, we've got Red Elemental Blast, and basically we'll do it like this. Well, it doesn't matter. So basically it's counter target blue spell or destroy target blue permanent. So in Legacy, it's not an unusual thing to have your stuff Force of Will or Dazed or whatever, and so you need to have something to combat your opponent doing counter spells. So having the 1 mana prevent your stuff from being countered, or not prevent, but countering their counter. Also, you can get rid of a Delver if need be. Stuff like that is pretty important. And lastly is we are keeping one of the paths in here. Path is to get rid of big creatures, similarly to Modern, but it looks a little bit different because you're generally not necessarily, or you are targeting Tarmogoyfs, but you're also targeting stuff like Gristlebrand, and you're also, instead of auto-conceding to Iona from Reanimator decks, you can tap your 1 white and play Path to keep the game going. So it's good in those respects as well. But yeah, this is the core of the deck. Oh, you also, so let me go over the reasons why we're keeping the other cards in too. Deflecting Palm in Legacy is also strong because you're dealing 2 damage, or basically redirecting damage. This also still works against Emrakul in Legacy, same thing. So all the applicable things that happen in Legacy also happen in Modern, also happen in Legacy. And then Grafdigger's Cage, same thing, except for what's played more often in Legacy is Natural Order decks and Green Sun Zenith decks, because both of those cards are not allowed in Modern. So these are strong. And then this gets even better because so many of the creatures are low toughness creatures in Legacy, and it can't be countered, so it can't be dazed or force of willed, is why this card is a fantastic card in Legacy. So if you guys have any questions about the decks, or the deck, how I have it, leave them in the comments down below. In total, this is 102 cards. While Dragon Shields is not a sponsor or anything like that, that's the reason why this deck exists, kind of, is because they give you extra sleeves. Generally, it's like 1 to 2 extra sleeves in your box. And it just so happened that I needed 102 cards to do the swap out from Modern to Legacy, because I play both. And so it beautifully worked out, and I can't complain. I love it. Burn is my jam, and I am a red mage at heart. I do play other decks, but this is my first love for sure. Thank you guys for watching, and have a good day.